yours?
Oh, microfilm I don't like to use, really. When I have used it, I mean, sometimes it's invaluable. For instance, for Stilwell, I found at the New York Public Library, by sheer chance, that there had been regimental journals, buff, who'd collected regimental journals, including one that was published in Peking when Stilwell was an officer there in the 15th Infantry. And I remember going through it and getting very bored and just feeling conscientious that I must go on and go finish the rolls, go through them all. Well, toward the end, I did find that there was a roll full of articles in this journal by Major Stilwell himself, which I didn't know he'd written. And if it hadn't existed there on microfilm, I never would have read it, never would have found it. And it gave me a tremendous insight into him, as well as into the conditions. But I don't really like using microfilm because, in the first place, it's on these machines, and at least in those days, they wiggle and they wobble, and it's an awful nuisance trying to get the text of the column in the right place to use it. And it's not like a book, anyway. I mean, a book is something you can handle, you put your hands on, take home with you if you get permission. And it doesn't ever seem as real. I don't really like microfilm except for the fact that it's often indispensable.
Nobody likes microfilm. I'm a historian by professional training. I hate microfilm. I've ruined my eyes using it. But we don't have any choices at the moment. There are very promising new technologies on the horizon, but they are only on the horizon. At the moment, microfilm is the tested, reliable technology that we have at our disposal.
This is a book published in 1924 on the history of Mexico.
Please read carefully. We haven't filmed it yet.
Look, I could rip this book up right on the spot. This book cannot be filmed here at Berkeley. This book should be replaced, but it cannot be replaced off of our copy. This copy can die a natural death here at Berkeley, but our particular own copy is not salvageable.
What if someone else has already filmed this?
All over the world, libraries face the same dilemma. So little money, so little time, and so many millions of books and papers slowly falling into destruction.
And we will not buy it again. Can we make that hard decision?
I don't think it makes much sense to say, well, this is on the shelf and it's deteriorating. Therefore, let's save it. When you have limited funds, I think you have to have a more systematic approach.
I think what we face is either the need to dramatically increase the amount of funding we have available to us, and perhaps even with that, to make some harder decisions about what we're going to preserve and what we're going to let go the route of planned deterioration, as the Library of Congress refers to the process.
Well, I'm hearing all of the needs, and I'm back to what Arthur was saying about the national or international preservation challenge of retaining the human record versus the Berkeley challenge of retaining a working library, a real library, a research library. I don't know where we're going to come out on that. And here again, it seems to me we are faced with the choice that the unfortunate souls on the Titanic were faced with. The boat's going down and there aren't enough lifeboats. And, we have to decide what are the women and children of our collection, who's going to be saved.
We have been placed in the position of French generals in charge of triage. We will determine who will survive, which culture will be preserved, which culture will not. And after 2,000 years, this is a very, very awesome responsibility to bear. If Orwell was writing now, Orwell would not say, ban things, so just publish on cheap paper. In 15 years, memory will be disappearing.
If we have the courage to measure honestly this chemical disease, this secret smoldering fire, the great damage is not to the rare books, which are carefully protected, nor even to the works of prominent authors, for whom, when one book dies, a copy can and will be freshly printed. No, the most terrible destruction will be to the great mass of ordinary materials. Among them, the records and statistics the Library of Congress relies on in filling the more than 400,000 requests for information received yearly from Congress.
AFDC limit plus my employment put us over the limit. So we did not receive any AFDC then.
The daily minutes of our lives, recorded in ordinary novels, ordinary texts, ordinary letters and diaries, even the poor, bad, or trivial ones. The great task of libraries worldwide is the preservation of the ordinary.
I remember when I was working in Texas on the cotton industry, which is very big in Texas, and I came upon a yearbook of the cotton industry dated 1849, and it told you more about what was actually happening than any other thing you could have found. It was a commercial publication. It was called, I think, Cotton Prices Current, and the big news in Cotton Prices Current was what was happening in Egypt, what was happening in India, what was happening in the cotton mills in Great Britain, what was happening in the revolution in Central Europe, where the use of cotton would diminish. And you suddenly realized that Texas was way over here, but their markets and the things which determined their value were way, way over there. And it's that sort of thing that the researcher comes upon, which he cannot hit by accident.
Problem is that we don't know what is junk and what is not. That's one problem we have by the time you sift through. Second, many of artifacts of humanity in the past have been lost, and naturally there will be losses too. What worries me is the deliberate indifference that exists towards this problem.
The most urgent thing that is needed is to begin running the books and journals under the cameras and capturing that information on film. We have to get the volume of pages that is being transferred up by a dramatic proportion if we're going to hope to save the materials that are going to self-destruct by the end of the century. At the moment, in a collection like this, where 30% of your collection is brittle, they can sustain one last use, and that's to get the information that they contain.
Of the making of books there is no end. So said Ecclesiastes. Ours is a paper culture, a civilization built on paper, bearing symbolic marks. We are, in fact, threatened by a paper flood. Every working day, into the complex of the Library of Congress flow 6,000 new items. Incredible as it seems, when all these new materials, new books are tested, 90% of them prove to be printed on papers that are acidic.
What do you think of Emmett's idea of making the carts 6 high instead of 4? Do you think that's going to have any impact on the number of books we can put in the chamber?
To deal with the chemical problem, some hopeful new chemical solutions. The Library of Congress, along with a few other libraries of the world, is developing a mass deacidification process to neutralize the acid in books on a large scale by putting thousands at a time into closed chambers and saturating them with a neutralizing vapor at a minimal cost per book. Yet even at a rate of 1 million books a year, to preserve the collection of the Library of Congress alone will take over 20 years.
Could have book handling activity during water removal and or post-conditioning.
paper mill. There's considerable movement now to use alkaline paper in the printing of books. Paper which will last hundreds, perhaps thousands of years longer. This mill is producing such paper, and doing it at a profit. And the alkaline paper produced here costs the publishers no more than acid paper. But not enough publishers require it, so the volume of demand is a problem, as is the initial investment for paper mills to convert to a different technology. There's an indirect but increasingly important advantage to alkaline papers. The manufacturing process is far less damaging to the environment, far less polluting to the streams and rivers that all paper mills require. Yet, as Lou Brown of S.D. Warren tells us,
it seems to me that there are a few publishers that honestly do care whether their books are produced on alkaline paper versus acid. But I would say the majority of the publishers in this country do not give it a great deal of consideration. If the public, the book buyer, would go into the bookstore and start asking the question, we want this book to be in a library, we want it to last, will it last? Will it stand up? Is it something that I can pass on to my children and have it look well, and all of those wonderful things, then that might start to create a demand and attention to the need for using alkaline paper.
And paper merchant and scholar Leonard Schlosser.
The real crux of it comes in the way in which books are manufactured. A publisher cannot make a special run of books to go into libraries distinct from those which go into the general marketplace. That whole group of books must be alike because it's economically unfeasible to do it any other way. If the publisher thinks the issue of permanence is important, then he will be conscious of this and will do something about the paper. If he does not think it's important but is secondary to other issues, as to such a simple one as the source from which he buys paper, then the paper will not be permanent. Permanent paper need not cost more.
Not all publishers are deaf to these important issues. All university presses now use acid-free paper, and the volume of university publication, once small, is growing rapidly. These presses have the good conscience to print books that can be read by our children and grandchildren and generations beyond. A common symbol for a national standard of paper permanence has been adopted, the mathematical sign for infinity. Our treasures are not only on paper, but since 1900 on crumbling spools of movie film. George Bernard Shaw in an early sound newsreel.
You know, I'm very glad you've come, because I like people to see me. I don't know how it is, but people who only know me from reading my books, or sometimes even from seeing my plays, get a most unpleasant impression of me.
In 1928, Shaw thought he was speaking for the ages. Not so. The newsreels and movies of the first half of the 20th century were made on nitrate stock, which turns into dust as surely as acid paper. Great efforts are now being made to duplicate and preserve our unique heritage of film.
Still, it's not necessary for me always to look as genial as I'm trying to look now. Of course, I can put on the other thing, for instance. Now that is what I call my Mussolini study.
Lieutenant Rodriguez, chanté par Monsieur Francisco pour la compagnie des phonographes Le Columbia.
From the earliest recording devices, all of recorded sound is also in danger. Records and tapes eventually crack, warp, peel, wear down, or remagnetize into mere noise. Still photographs are also vulnerable, though they can be read by laser and re-recorded on video disc. That way they can be reviewed without damage to originals. A good example of technology coming to the rescue of an earlier technology. But we must be wary of the dangers of inner destruction, even in the new. More and more, the raw data of our civilization are contained on magnetic materials. Materials subject to their own slow and secret fires, their own forms of deterioration, and to technological obsolescence. Often it's harder and more perplexing to preserve the most advanced technologies. Technology has penetrated the very heart of modern libraries. More and more, the catalogs of national treasures are being electronically bound together, city to city, continent to continent, to form vast integrated magnetic memories.
Well, the machines you're looking at now are the storage devices for the database of the Research Libraries Information Network. There are 26 million records, plus or minus, that live on these devices that can be accessed at any moment in time by more than 900 terminals across the country and, for that matter, around the world. These machines are, in fact, the storage devices for, at this point, about 26 million records of library material, representing a portion of the holdings of more than 100 libraries in North America, and now some cataloging records as well from as far away as London.
In an increasing atmosphere of commercialization, some difficult, profound, and disturbing questions. Who will buy? Who will sell? And who will control this new universal network of information?
Of concern about the fact that we'll have information haves and have-nots, because the electronic format permits a control over the ownership of that information that was not possible before. And as you know, we have a for-profit enterprise that is moving into the whole scholarly environment based on a fee per use. In other words, that you have to pay before you can use the information, and that you don't buy it, you only buy the use, which is very different from the subsidized browsing concept that we have had in the book era. And I think it has tremendous implications for public policy in this country.
Other thoughtful people have pondered these issues.
It's quite odd, you know, that when people talk about technology, they usually don't include the book. And yet the book is probably the most important technological innovation that man has ever made. The one that has transformed his thinking and every other aspect of his life. So that when we think of technology, we mustn't think only of the latest technology. It's also notable that technologies don't always displace their predecessors. In fact, there are very few examples of technologies that have outdated or made totally obsolete their predecessors. We know in our own experience that when people came upon the radio, many people thought it would make the telephone obsolete. Why should you pay to send a message by a wire when you could send it over the air free? And then with television, it was suggested that, of course, people wouldn't listen to radio anymore. But I think the statistics show that there are more radios now than there have ever been, and the rate of increase of radio, people walk with radios in their ears, which nobody had ever thought would happen. But they still carry books in their pockets, and they're likely to continue to do so even after it's possible for us to drive our automobiles while we're watching television.
Technology is a tool. Technology does not make demands on us. We make demands on technology. My worries about current euphoria, about how everything is going to be solved, are coupled. Number one, you may know where the book is. You still have to read it. People have forgotten that. They say access to information. Book is not information alone. Book is source of knowledge as well. And there's a great deal of confusion between undigested information and its distillation into structured knowledge. That somehow has gotten lost. Second, which is far more dangerous, they think if it's not in the computer, it doesn't exist. There are many things which are not in computer data. In this library alone, there are millions of items which are not in computer data. People just check the computer and say, well, it's not there. We have manuscript sources, archival sources. Namely, there's no easy way to knowledge, easy road to knowledge. That's one of the reasons Rabelais in Gargantua, Rabelais had the author eat the book in order to digest it. You have to digest it. There is no substitute for critical thinking. Information is a neutral data. It's what you ask, how you structure, how you use.
Stone, clay, canvas, paper, tape, and disc. A human diary. A chain of knowledge that connects everyone to everyone else. All our faith, passion, and skill, all the horror and beauty of the generations past are left for us to ponder. Unless we choose to let it wither, disintegrate, burn, and die, leaving us to stumble in the dark.
Bundesminister, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, on behalf of the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, I welcome you all to this international conference on preservation of library materials.
For the delegates to Vienna, and for the world, the challenge of the next few years will be crucial. What is at stake is the progress, and perhaps the destiny, of civilization itself.
We are here assembled in the most beautiful Baroque Prunksaal of the Austrian State Library, a hall which impresses me time and again. When this Prunksaal was built by Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, 1723 to 26, books were printed on chemical neutral, that means acid-free paper, so that the problem of preservation which faces us today was still unknown. But 260 years later, the situation is quite different. The book treasures in many libraries of the world are deteriorating with accelerated speed from year to year. This fact is not only true for the valuable holdings of libraries suffering from hostile climatic conditions or from insufficient storage facilities, but also for the materials in libraries in the industrialized world due to air pollution, acidated paper, and last but not least, heavy use. The overall assignment of conservation preservation is really of a Herculean dimension, and the intellectual, organizational, technical, and financial difficulties should by no means be underestimated. I hope that the recommendations of this conference will lead to quick and concerted actions.
If individuals have any sense of the importance of the continuity of the human experience, they can't avoid the problem of preservation of the human record. To fail to do so is, in a sense, to turn your back on history. And it's a kind of an egotistical action of the highest order to think that what's gone before is unimportant. What we're doing here is trying to find a way to save what's important from the past. What we've got to do is make an honest effort to make certain that at least a portion of the past is preserved, not only for our own use, but for the future. Those who will follow us will, I think, rightfully say that we have, in a sense, failed them if we don't make that honest effort.